Good evening, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Thanks for joining us on this Tuesday evening. I thank Nadine for organising this many months in advance. But on today, the 9th of October, we decided to hold a meeting on Israel, Gaza, and the wider regional conflict, assessing the probability of broader war. So I think our timing is indicative of just how kind of on the pulse and predictive LSE can be. I'm Toby Dodge. I teach international relations in the International Relations Department, and under LSE's 17-page code of conduct of free speech, I'm an independent and non-biased chair that guarantees the right to freedom of speech of our panelists and our audience. So welcome. We're lucky to have a fine panel, I think, of regional experts. I think Nadine and I worked really hard to get these three people to come, so I think we're in for an intellectual treat. Each will speak for 5 to 10 minutes. I'll then ask a few opening questions, probably not many at all, because I can see we have an audience of people who know a lot more than I do about the situation. So I'll then open it up. As I've said, this is a public event, and it is overseen by LSE's Code of Practice on Free Speech, which protects and promotes freedom of speech. So if I feel at any time during the meeting freedom of speech is somewhat encroached, I'm sure it won't be. With this panel and with this audience, I shall take you through it. We're going to be engaging in critical discussion, and there'll be ample time for Q&A. I mean, the whole idea of a panel and limiting the panel's opening speech to 5 to 10 minutes is to give the space to the audience, which leads us to the panel, I think. Let me start with Professor Nicola Pratt, who's a professor of international politics of the Middle East at the University of Warwick. She teaches and researches the international politics of the Middle East with particular interest in feminism, queer and decolonial approaches and politics from below, a research interest linked to her activism in the anti-war and Palestine solidarity movement. And she was from 2010 to 2013 the co-director of the International Research Project between Warwick and Bears 8 University in Palestine entitled Reconceptualizing Gender and Transnational Perspectives. Our most recent book is Embodying Geopolitics, Generations of Women's Activism in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon with the University of California Press. It was also the University of California Press that she wrote a superb book on Iraq, which I can recommend to you as well, so you can take your pick. Sitting next to me is an old friend of mine, Mohammed Ali Shabani, the editor of the quite simply excellent Amwaj Media, a platform focusing on Iran, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula countries, which, for my money at least, if you want to take the chair's word for anything, is quite simply the best source of analysis in English on Iran and Iraq. So I thoroughly recommend that to you. He's based in London, but frequently travels to the Middle East. And his commentary and analysis has appeared in leading outlets, New York Times, Guardian, Foreign Affairs, CNN, BBC, World News, Al Jazeera. Which leads us, last but not least, to our final contributor today, Yazid Saeed, who is a senior fellow at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where he works on the comparative political and economic roles of the Arab armed forces. If you haven't seen his work on the Egyptian army, I again thoroughly recommend it. And I think a piece that he wrote on hybrid states, I'm still citing today, and that was probably about 10 years ago. But it says more about the longevity of his writing than the breadth and depth of my reading. So Yazid previously taught at King's, where he was a professor of war studies, University of Cambridge and the University of Oxford. And in the long distance past, he was the head of the Middle East program at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Now, he's possibly, one of the many reasons he's on this panel is that he was an advisor, a negotiator and policy planner in the Palestinian delegation to the peace talks with Israel 1991 to 2002, and then advised on Palestinian public institutional reform. But we must mention, I think, his big book, which shaped my thinking, the Armed Struggle and the Search for the State, the Palestinian National Movement, 1949 to 1993, with Oxford University Press. And the students amongst you, if you're working on Middle East politics, I would run to the library and get the available copies out after we finish speaking, because it's a simply superb book. So, after that introduction, we have our three speakers. Nicola will go first, 5 or 10 minutes, and then Mohammed, and finally Yazid. So, Nicola, take it away.
Thank you very much. I want to start by saying thank you to Toby for inviting me, and Nadine as well, and all Nadine's organising efforts, and thank you everyone for being here. So this week we passed a grim milestone. I'm both heartbroken and angry that this has been going on now for 12 months. And not only that, but in the last few weeks, the war has extended to Lebanon. So my thoughts and prayers are with everybody here who might have friends, family in the region who are currently facing bombs, bullets, and displacement. So the framing of the panel was to consider whether a wider war in the Middle East is likely. But I think for me the question is not maybe the likelihood of the war, but rather the necessity to stop it now. The longer it goes on, the more likely it is that the more and more actors will become involved, and that we face a forever war. More and more people will be displaced, more and more lives will be ruined. In Gaza, already we have a whole generation of people who are traumatized. We've got high numbers of people with life-changing injuries, amputees. It's going to take, even if the bombings stop tomorrow, it will take years just to clear away the rubble, to rebuild the infrastructure. Even if it's even possible that Gaza will cease to exist in its current state. So the stakes are really high. We've got the possibility for an all-out war in a way is it's something that we can pontificate about, but we're talking about the lives, the real, people's real lives on the ground that are already being changed, in some cases in irreversible ways. And it's not just Gaza, obviously, it's the West Bank where whilst all the attention has been on Gaza in the last 12 months, Israel has been expanding its settlements. It's been also destroying civilian infrastructure. It's been displacing Palestinians and increasing the likelihood of further ethnic cleansing. And then now we have the potential that we'll see what some people have called the Gazification of Lebanon, or at least the southern suburbs of Beirut and southern Lebanon. Because it's clear after more than 12 months of this war that Israel has no more red lines. The unprecedented level of violence that Israel has inflicted on the people in Gaza, when you compare it not only to previous wars, where perhaps, in 2008 to 2009, there were around 1,500 Palestinians who were killed. In 2014, around 2,000 Palestinians. In the current war, within the first week or so, Israel had killed 3,000 Palestinians. So the unprecedented level of violence, I think, has shown that Israel has no more red lines, which should make us very afraid for the continuation of this war. And the US has also shown that it has no red lines, despite the many times it has said, Israel needs to minimize the number of casualties, Israel needs to abide by international law, the invasion of Rafah is a red line, the escalation of war is a red line, but nothing nothing that the US has said Israel has paid attention to, and it really highlights actually that for the US, it's prepared to do anything to continue to back Israel because there's been no accountability. It took months to get a ceasefire resolution at the UN Security Council. And since that ceasefire resolution passed in May, there's been nothing. The International Criminal Court Chief Prosecutor issued warrants for the arrest of Netanyahu and Gallant back in May. Still, the ICC judges have yet to issue those warrants. And without any accountability, again, the likelihood that Israel will just continue is, I think it's without question. And whilst the current violence is unprecedented, on the other hand, the scale of it is unprecedented. Let's not forget, though, that Israel has regularly used high levels of violence and force in pursuing its objectives. So what we're seeing currently in Lebanon, we only have to think about Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, Israel's attack on Lebanon in 2006. Even in the 2006 war, Israel coined the term the Dahir Doctrine to describe the strategy of inflicting massive destruction on civilian infrastructure in the hope that civilians would thereby then pressure their political and military leaders to surrender. And this also seems to be part of the thinking behind massive destruction of civilian infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. But whilst this, as I say, the scale of this violence is unprecedented, the doctrine goes back even further than the Dahir Doctrine of 2006. We can recall that in the early years of Zionist colonization of Palestine, even before the State of Israel was founded, the Zionist leader, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, was very clear in spelling out the need for the Zionist movement to use force to achieve its aims. I quote, "If you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living," Jabotinsky wrote in 1925, "you must find a garrison for the land or find a benefactor who will provide a garrison on your behalf. Zionism is a colonizing venture and therefore it stands or falls on the question of armed forces," end quote. And definitely since the 1970s, Israel has had its staunchly supported benefactor in the shape of the United States. The United States every year has given billions of dollars, of military aid to Israel, and in the last year alone, according to a recent report by the Cost of War Project at Brown University, the US has given almost 18 billion to Israel. So it also seems that not only are there no red lines for the US, but there are also an unlimited budget for Israel to pursue its military aims. But Israel has mistakenly believed that it can achieve security through military means, and that obviously has not been the case. Israel's use of violence has consistently generated further resistance, often in the form of armed resistance, but not only. So we can think back in history. So the PLO obviously emerged in relation, as a response to the dispossession of Palestinians in 1948 and the continuing prevention of Palestinian self-determination in their homeland. The PLO for several years waged armed struggle across the border from its base in Lebanon, provoking Israel to then invade Lebanon in 1982 and occupy the south of Lebanon in order to expel the PLO and prevent its re-emergence there. But then what happened? Instead, Hezbollah emerged as an armed resistance movement to Israeli occupation. And then also we look to what happened after the defeat of the PLO. Then you had the emergence of Hamas to take up the torch of armed resistance. And so it goes on. So I have to wrap up now. I need to say something. So my end point is that in order to stop this current war, we need to go to the roots of the war, which is the continued prevention of Palestinian freedom, which is what's creating instability in the region.
Thank you. Sorry, Nicola, for cutting you off.
Sorry.
Mohammed, tell us about Iran's strategy, what Iran's gone through, and what do you think it might do next? Not to ask you to do too much.
No, I'll try to be to the point. I'll address more recent events in my remarks, and first and foremost, also like to thank you, Toby, for arranging this timely event. October 7th. Was it a win or a loss for Iran? I think this is a key question for many analysts, and it's a lot of division in how it's viewed. On the one hand, some view it as a grand victory. Why? Because it succeeded in preventing what was by many seen as potential normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Israel. And for Iran, that would have been potentially a disaster. So some view the events of October 7 as very good for Iran in that sense. There are others who see it as a total disaster, not just because of what's happened in recent weeks in Lebanon, but because a major strategic priority for Iran has always been to forge sanctions relief and engage in negotiations with the United States over its nuclear program. That was about to happen in late September 2023. You had October 7, which meant that it became politically toxic, almost impossible for Biden to be seen with Iran's leaders, even though Iran at that time was not being accused of direct involvement. So it's, and again, in many ways been a double-edged sword. It depends on how you look at it. Over the following year, I think Iran tried to really thread the needle between imposing pressure on Israel on the one hand, and that's where we see the strategy that's known as unity of fronts. October 8th, the day after October 7th, Hezbollah entered this conflict and they started attacking, to the best of my knowledge, disputed territory that's supposedly belonging to Syria, but Lebanon claimed. It's called the Sheba Farms. And that's where it began, and we've seen escalation ever since. And part of the reason for the unity of fronts is to prevent Israel from dismantling the axis of resistance, the regional constellation of allies of Iran, one by one. So when they're done in Gaza, move on to Lebanon, and so on, so on and so forth. And that strategy, I think, has had both successes and failures, as we can see today. Israel is now fighting in Lebanon. So what they wanted to avoid, which is an expansion of the war, happened in the end. They couldn't stop it. Maybe could have delayed it, but they didn't stop it. So why did it fail? I think there are two key reasons. Number one is strong misperception of capabilities and will. This doesn't mean Hezbollah is finished. We're going to get to that. But the idea is that there's been a reality check about will and about capability. Number two is also another misperception, which is the extent to which the U.S. is no longer a restraining factor on Israel at all. And the previous speaker referred to this with reference to funding. Give you one statistic. I think since 2014-15, when Israel signed a 10-year security assistance agreement with the United States, under which Israel received about $4 billion a year in military aid, over the past 12 months, Israel has received an additional $18 billion. So it's more than 500%, almost 500% what the usual was. And to put that figure even more in perspective, that's double Iran's total annual military spending. That's the amount of arms and aid that's going in. And I think there was a total misperception on the behalf of Iran and the Axis, the extent to which the Biden administration were willing to go this deeply behind Israel. Not just with money, not just with weapons, also with total political cover, intelligence support. We don't even know about the logistical side yet. So there's a lot of misperception. So where are we now? I think there's a lot of talk about implosion of the Axis after the killing of Nasrallah, the Hezbollah military leadership, and the killing of Nasrallah is problematic for Iran and the Axis for several reasons. First and foremost is that the real successor of the previous commander of the Quds Force, the expeditionary branch of the IRGC, was not Ismail Qani. The true successor was Nasrallah. So Nasrallah was not just a cleric, he wasn't just a political leader. He was also involved in a lot of strategy for Iran in the region. He was also even involved in tactical decisions. So he was a cleric, politician / military commander. And this became more and more evident in recent years. So this got to the extent where he commanded a certain authority in the region that Iran didn't even command. And I'll give you two specific examples of this, which Riyad and Watch have covered. Number one is in Iraq, where key Shia cleric, who was once a friend of Iran, and now, I don't know what to call him, maybe a frenemy, Muqtada Sadr, very difficult for Iran to contain, and this Sadrist movement became the single largest bloc in October 2021 parliamentary elections. Iraq is due to hold elections next year. Don't know what's going to happen there. Very difficult to contain. The only person that managed to prevent all-out intra-Shia war last year, not last year, October 2022, was Nasrallah. He managed to pick up the phone and prevent that from happening in the Green Zone. Another person in the region who apparently listens more to Nasrallah, or listened more to Nasrallah than Khamenei, is Abdel Malik. And the Houthi leader, when looks at Nasrallah, looks at Hezbollah, sees somebody actually wants to emulate. And I don't think that's the case with Khamenei when it looks at Khamenei. So now the problematic dynamic that we're seeing from Iran is who is going to manage this very diverse array of actors and their conflicts and making sure that there's cohesion. I think this is going to be a medium-term challenge for Iran. So again, bigger picture, more division ahead, harder to manage these actors, but this doesn't mean the Axis is going anywhere. Part of the reason why Israel managed to infiltrate Hezbollah is because it became increasingly institutionalized. It was no longer the small group of people which had very rigid vetting procedures. When they went into Syria, they had to expand. And from Syria, it went into Iraq, went into Yemen, etc. It became a multinational organization. It has over 100,000 fighters on its payroll. And when you talk a lot about the killing of the Hezbollah leadership, 1,001 special forces commanders were killed. Many others among the 400 who've been killed have been senior officials, military officials. But the unit has almost 400 commanders. And many of the people being killed, they were about to retire. Even Nasrallah himself was 64 years old. He was not a spring chicken, right? So he wasn't going to stay there forever. So the question here is when people talk about the implosion of Hezbollah because Nasrallah is no longer there, would you have argued the same thing in 10 years from now if he would have passed? Naturally. No. So this institutionalization of the Axis, I think in Lebanon is going to mean that Hezbollah is going to remain as a fighting force. And the more Israel goes into it via land, the more Hezbollah will reactivate its raison d'etre, which is to resist, right? In Iraq, what we've seen is something completely different. It's really unimaginable just years ago. We've seen a ragtag group of militia actors which emerged very shadowy in 2003. And there was talk about them, the militia versus state. Militia is the state. What do I mean by militia is the state? I'm talking about the fact that right now they're allocated $3 billion a year. Iraq just a couple of months ago approved a 3-year budget, meaning they've been allocated $9 billion through 2025. They don't need Iran's money. They have their own money. Iraq is now a place where Iran generates revenue, doesn't spend revenue, meaning these are autonomous actors. And they're not going to go anywhere. But most of all, I think the biggest shift we've seen within the Axis over the past year has been Yemen, where again, a group of fighters that were seen as fighting in the mountains with slippers, not only did they finally come to push out the UAE from Yemen, force a halt in the fighting with Saudi Arabia, but now also basically close the Red Sea to commercial shipping. They've been the rising star of the Axis over the past year. And they are, again, as I mentioned previously, very difficult to manage. They're very autonomous. They're not going to go anywhere. They're a very long-term problem for, I think, everybody in the region. So, final thoughts. I'm sorry, I'm not being nuclear. So, this axis of resistance, this regionalized network, in many ways were, or still is, forward defense for Iran. So if forward defense is under threat, what happens? Primary defense. One major primary defense issue for the West is Iran's nuclear program. This is why the more the axis is under attack, the more you're going to have debate within Iran about weaponizing the nuclear program. That's where we are today. That's the trajectory we're looking at. There's so much more to bring up, but I look forward to questions from the audience. I'm happy to address them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, that was really good, thank you. So I'll leave it to Yazid and 5 to 10 minutes to sum it up and then kind of paint the bigger picture and take our very educated audience to what this means for international relations and international history. So no small talk for you, but all in 10 minutes, please.
Good to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. I want to pick up from something Muhammad said, which is the extent to which Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas committed incredibly massive errors of judgment and misconception from 7 October onwards. I could go into a lot more detail on that, but I think we've seen that there have been assumptions, fundamental assumptions, lying behind how each of them operated and acted, that have all been proven terribly wrong at horrific cost to everyone. I then want to sort of diverge a little bit from the official title of the panel, in the sense I'm not going to zoom downwards on regional war. I'm going to zoom outwards and try and take a much broader perspective. For me, the 7 October attack by Hamas last year was something of a Sarajevo moment, by which I mean the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914, which was sort of the opening shot of World War I, which involved many major countries and left millions dead. I think of Sarajevo, I thought of it on the first day because for a very long time I've seen the sort of long swell of social, economic, political, institutional, technological change across the world, and how that was transforming politics from, India to Europe, to North America, to the Middle East, of course. And what Sarajevo did was it simply provided the trigger and allowed forces and dynamics that had been building up for the previous 2 or 3 decades, the race for colonies, the race for mineral wealth, the race for closing off trade zones, and the competition that was growing between the great powers from the late 19th century. That was the real backdrop. That was where the drive to war really came from. Sarajevo simply got it going. And in this sense, we're in a moment in world history, and by moment I mean that in a very broad historical sense, i.e. a few decades, where we also have been witnessing for the last several decades the results of globalization, dislocation, anomie, whatever words you want to use, again across the globe. And this has been giving rise to new kinds of politics, a shift towards the right across much of the globe, far right in some cases, neo-Nazism in East Germany, fascism, militarized, literally militias in the US, for instance, Proud Boys, what else are they except white supremacist militias, gunmen in Norway, shooting dozens of youth of the Socialist Party summer camp. These have been signs that we've been seeing. Others, the rise of the parliamentary right wing, that basically now, runs the European Commission thanks to its position in the European Parliament. Why Marine Le Pen might be the next president of France. Why Meloni is already prime minister in Italy. Modi in India. These are parties that understood that they could organize over a very long time to take power from within the system. But then there are people, of course, who are further to the right and more outliers. But broadly speaking, this has been a continuous expansion, a continuous rising curve for at least the last 2 decades, I'd argue for more. To come back to the region, what I'm trying to say is, when we talk about war, whether it's between Israelis and Palestinians, Israelis and Lebanese, a wider war, Iran, we're not talking about this in the context of, let's say, 2006, let alone 1996, when Israel and Hezbollah fought, or say 1982, when the PLO and Israel fought in Lebanon, as Nicola was saying earlier. We're in a different world right now. We're not in those places. And that leads me to a couple of other things, which have to do with the nature of international law, the laws of war, the international humanitarian law, etc. And I want to come back to that at the end of my remarks. But first, a quick reminder, if you do a tiny little tour d'horizon around the region, the Middle East, Nicola said something earlier about sort of demographic trends, I think, in Israel. Unless I'm mistaken, but there are changes in society across the Middle East, which in a place like Sudan have left the country in a horrific war, with at least 2 million people facing the prospect of starvation. Yemen and Libya right now in some sort of precarious, fragile armed truce. Lebanon, Palestine, i.e. the Palestinian occupied territories or autonomous areas, even before 7 October, lived a precarious truce. Syria, which is partly in a state of truce, partly in a state of war, with the jihadist Turkey-backed opposition, the Kurdish Rojava area, and Iraq, bluntly, is, we've seen with the immense violence that was used against protesters a few years ago, the internal struggles in Kurdistan, the deep divisions within the Peshmerga. All these are countries that, where the political settlements, the sort of basic understandings upon which some kind of peace was established, whether after the British left, or after the Ba'ath came to power, or after the latest conflict, these political settlements have collapsed. They don't exist anymore. There is no form for intra-elite bargaining or negotiation. And in a sense, Israel, I think, has reached that point too, because what we see today in Israel is far-right elements in government. They may be in the minority numerically, but what we see is something we've seen in the past, and here's where I'll be coming back to my other historical references, where the center, the liberals, abdicate the arena to the right wing. In this country, it's basically, we don't confront conservatives on immigration or racism. We talk about how we have to fight anti-Semitism, which is crucial. It's fundamental. It's a hugely important thing. But it's performed. It's a performance of liberal virtue by people like Emmanuel Macron or German politicians and media, or, Keir Starmer in this country, who basically waged his civil war within the Labour Party against Jeremy Corbyn. I'm not making a plug for either. But he weaponized anti-Semitism. Nothing to do with Israel-Palestine. Not in particular, I think, to do with the Jews of this country, but primarily because he was waging a civil war with another wing of his own party. And we see this played out in place after place after place, where anti-Semitism has not been weakened. It's on the rise, which is a horrific thing to say. In a country like Germany, which supposedly is passing law after law to fight it, and yet clearly they've not resolved it, where they've got neo-Nazis emerging in East Germany. And what do the liberals and the centrists do? They sort of look the other way, don't talk about racism, don't talk about anti-immigration, don't talk about Islamophobia, because these are not popular with the voters or whatever it is. They abdicate the arena. So when I look at the Middle East, there's no cavalry who are going to come save Yemen, or Sudan. I mean, why is it that so little has been done for Sudan in the past several years since the military took power again? Basically, absolutely nothing. So what we see in Gaza, or we see in Lebanon, is an extension of something we've already been seeing for a while, and that's been growing and deepening and intensifying. And here's where I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts and I'll stop, which is that, I mean, for all our concern about human lives that are being lost or devastated in Israel, in Palestine, in Lebanon, and across the region, you know, we part of, if we're going to fight that, we have to fight it here, wherever we are. Because here we've got, you know, issues of poverty, domestic abuse. The right is all about not just fighting immigrants, it fights reproductive rights, it fights all sorts of things. And if we're not, you know, we can't just favor this one struggle over there as the one thing that matters. Because if you're a US voter right now, and you don't want to vote for Joe Biden, well, he's out of the picture. And you're not going to vote for Donald Trump, I would hope. But it's a very tough one. Do you vote for Kamala Harris, who doesn't sound like she's any different from Joe Biden? And if it's just about Palestine, you might say, well, no, you know, I'm going to vote someone else. But then you might meet an African American who'll say, we struggled for years to where we are, and we can't afford a Trump victory. How do you answer that? And we have to be cognizant of these kinds of struggles. And so the last two things I want to say, and which scare me a lot, are that we talk about, and we have in the past year talked about, and we cry, just how little the rule of law, which is the international legal framework, international humanitarian law, has counted for our governments. For weeks, for months, it was almost a criminal act in the USA or Germany or France or even here to use the word ceasefire. Astonishing. Now, one might have a critique of the international legal system post-45, that it was always sort of shaped and created and dominated by the Western powers and the capitalist powers and so on, which is true. But it also was there, and it was something that the third world, the global south, also took part in, and to some extent utilized and helped protect itself with. We're in a moment where it's not just about trying to revive that international legal system or the laws of war and get them working and observed and respected. I think they're gone already. I think we're already past that moment. These frameworks are behind us. The same would apply, let's say, for the World Trade Organization. You know, I mean, that is no longer a viable structure. These things are behind us. And the laws of war, I'll bet you that from Beijing through New Delhi, through, you know, anyone else who counts, all the way through all of the Western world, what people learned in the last few weeks, military leaders and political leaders, is, wow, look what you can do with artificial intelligence-driven technology at war. This is the first sort of Star Wars. I mean, this is, for me, this is War of the Worlds. I've been watching that on Apple TV, you know, the remake. It's like that. It's, you know, the way people are targeted. It's astonishing. But what these people in power will be thinking right now is, how do we do that? And of course, they immediately realize that the existing laws of war that they supposedly abide by and that they train their military on won't fit comfortably with this new kind of war. And they're probably already asking themselves, how do we rewrite those laws? And the only reason I think they might want to rewrite them rather than discard them completely is because they do realize that if American or British or French or whatever soldiers face Putin's men down the line, and they're all going to be using these methods, then if they don't provide some kind of new legal framework, then they've got none at all, no kind of protection whatsoever of the kind that the Geneva Convention sort of provided. What we've seen is not simply drones and pagers, exploding pagers. We've seen where it's okay to kill tens of thousands of people and demolish entire cities to create free fire zones and to prevent, you know, you don't want to wage urban combat, then get rid of the urban space. These become the new rules of war. And this is what I fear is where we're heading. And so this is again why we have to face this on a sort of universalist level. And this is not just about Gaza and South Lebanon, sadly, I mean, for me.
Right, thank you very much. I think we've had three very different interventions, but also three incredibly rich ones. I think that Nicola putting the current conflict in a wide historical perspective and raising questions about the driving strategy and dynamism of Israel. I think we've had Mohammed raising some serious questions about the future policy of Iran, its commitment to nuclearization, but also a series of profound misperceptions across the axis of resistance. And then finally, Yazid putting all that in a much wider perspective that sums up with the kind of futurology of what's technology and what this war will drive in terms of the final death of international law, the laws of war, and a new strategy. The idea that you simply remove the open space is incredibly chilling. So, I have a few questions, but if you want to jump in, if there's someone with burning questions, I'll pick you, and then I'll come back to Mary. Yes, you.
Hello, thank you so much for all of your speeches. I particularly wanted to ask, is it
You say we got you need to introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm Tiggs. What do I do? I work primarily for bail for immigration detainees, and I have worked, I've been an activist on Palestinian freedom for a long time, and that was primarily actually in the US last year. I was studying at Harvard when everything escalated in October, so I was very involved in the American encampments, etc. Yeah, and I wanted to particularly ask, is it Yazid? Yeah. I really like this kind of framing of putting it into a wider global context, and I think, you can't separate the white angry men in the streets of the UK, Plymouth, where I'm from, and had rocks thrown in my head by white men in the streets, and I don't think you can separate that from what's happening in Palestine and the wider region. Obviously, we've seen very much a researched increase in Islamophobic violence in the UK since October 7th. But I wanted to know whether you think that was already rising, and then also, kind of the already rising Islamophobia has fueled this kind of just complete disregard for like Muslim lives, for Arab lives, like whether, have they fed each other, or was it that there was already this rising this kind of Islamophobia that has allowed.
That's the question?
Yeah, that's the
Excellent, right. Anyone else? Yes, you, sir.
Yes. Good evening, excellent talks. My name's John Robson, I'm a retired lawyer. My question is, do you agree with me that our present Prime Minister's position is particularly egregious in that he has put himself forward as a lawyer, as a former Director of Public Prosecutions, and in particular the points that Nicola has referred to earlier with regard to the international institutions, the ICJ and the ICC, where Britain, where Britain was in effect a founding father of the latter, now is still standing side by side, along with his foreign secretary, with the Israeli Prime Minister.
Excellent. And a question, yeah, there you go. If we could try to make the microphone bearer run around, but this is the last one. Well, I'll take this one and one more, and then we'll come back to the drones.
Yeah, I'm a freelance journalist, been covering the Middle East for many years. My question is, I read that the Houthis said that through a secret channel, America had told them that if you stop targeting ships and blowing them up, we will recognise your sovereignty over the whole of Yemen. My question is, do you think it's possible the Americans said this, and who do they think they are to recognise anybody's sovereignty over the whole of Yemen? And also in regards to the Southern Transitional Council, who are trying to get a separate South Yemen state, what do you think the possibility of that is?
Excellent. Well, that was 4 questions. So if you hold at that, I'll go back to the panel and then come again. We have, as I said, 4 questions. I think over here, the wider context and addressed to Yazid, but all free to jump in. the kind of rise, it's basically about the causes of rising Islamophobic violence in Britain. Is this context specific, or did you predict it? Would you have predicted it as part of the larger trends you clearly identified? I think that the second question from my retired lawyer is about Starmer. And I quote the question there, and I'm not passing comment on it myself, and his rejection of both international laws and international institutions and what we think of that. Then from Karen we have two different questions. One about this rumor that the Americans are trying to negotiate Houthi sovereignty over the whole of Yemen for a halt in the attack of the Red Sea. But secondly, the Southern Council and the ability for a secessionist state in southern Yemen, basically. Right, who wants to go first? Nicola, you can go first.
I'll take Tom's question. I mean, yes, I agree with you. It is egregious. And I mean, I don't know what else to say actually at this point. It's amazing I think one of my observations is it's really amazing just how pro-Israeli our political class has become over the last few years. So I think that probably Keir Starmer is more pro-Israeli than Margaret Thatcher, to be honest. I mean, Margaret Thatcher had a much more critical position, for example, on Israel's probably the invasion and siege of Lebanon in 1982 than Keir Starmer has regarding what Israel is currently doing. And what's even worse though is the UK state is aiding Israel because under the previous government there were reports of UK planes being part of reconnaissance flights over Gaza, and just recently the UK sent over some military flights which potentially are also there for support with Israel's invasion of Lebanon. So although it's not publicly talked about, and the mainstream media have done a really bad job, I think, as well of holding the government to account. The UK government is not just a bystander. So
let me push on that if I may, because there was a startling comparison that I shall now forever remember your positive comparison of Margaret Thatcher.
Yes, I was very fond of Margaret.
But the point being, I suspect, is your historical sweep, saying Margaret Thatcher demanding Israeli concessions and a change of policy during the siege of Beirut right up until now. And you're quite right, you say this is an example of a transformation of the ruling elite. This is bipartisan, so this is both conservative, Labour, I'm not quite sure where the Liberals stand, but I'm not sure it matters. So from that point of view, why? What do you think is causality behind that?
Well, I'm not an expert on UK politics, so I don't want to.
But sadly, we both live.
I don't really want to speculate, but I think that it's not come suddenly. So there has been. It's either to do with how the UK sees its changing strategic interests in the region. Again, but I'm not a UK foreign policy specialist either. Or obviously there is the pressure of pro-Israel groups within the UK. We're not allowed to talk about that in case we get accused of peddling conspiracy theories. But there has been a change over time. So I'm hoping that somebody's looked into it more closely. I'm just seeing the symptoms of it, which is being felt on the ground in the Middle East.
I'm going to leave you to last, but I think because we discussed earlier that I think there's a kind of we bring in changing elite attitudes to Israel to your kind of larger suite. But I wanted to ask Mohammed to try and tackle Karen's two questions. One about possible negotiations between the Houthis and Washington, but two, I suppose, the possibility of a secessionist movement being successful in southern Lebanon. Have you got any insight?
If I may, prior to that, address another point which I think is really vital when you look at the region, and that is a question of technology in warfare. Israel has really been cutting edge in its application of things like AI for target acquisition, military operations, but it's a dialectical process, it's a two-way process. What do I mean by this? We've seen new actors and older actors adopting technologies that were unthinkable only a few years ago. I'll give you three specific examples, which are truly game changers. Number one, there's a new entity in Iraq called the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, which are now routinely lobbing drones and cruise missiles at Israel. This is unheard of and unthinkable just only a couple of years ago, that they would have that kind of range and access to that kind of technology. The second thing are the Houthis, which in early 2022 for the first time launched drone attacks, missile attacks on the UAE. And at the time, it was a huge shock. People thought, how can they reach the UAE? 800-900 kilometers away, this is unheard of to have that kind of range. And since October 7, there's been one group that managed to carry out a deadly attack in Tel Aviv. Hasn't been Hamas, hasn't been Hezbollah, hasn't been the Houthis. And they launched missiles 2,000 kilometers away. Again, now they're claiming to have hypersonic missiles. Again, this level of technology, we're talking about people who were characterized as fighting with slippers in the mountains a decade ago. And now they're lobbing up hypersonic missiles. There's been a leap in kind of technological field. Having said that, they're nowhere near Israel. The final point I'd like to make about technology and its adoption is we're about to publish a report, so it's not public yet, but in February this year, the US assassinated an Iraqi commander of Qatar Hezbollah. This person was in charge of drone training for Bahrainis. And that Bahraini entity which he trained in April claimed an operation against Israel from Iraqi territory. What's the significance of this? The significance of this is that if they can reach Israel from Iraq, they can reach Bahrain. So if the Bahraini authorities manage to crack down on dissent within their own boundaries, what do they do if they have armed opponents in third countries? Do they launch war against Iraq? It's not just Bahrain, it's also talking about the UAE, talking about Saudi Arabia, etc. So we've seen this proliferation of technology, which has really allowed many of these groups to apply low-cost methods to engage in warfare that was unthinkable and give them a level of range that nobody thought about previously. About Yemen, very briefly, sounds like absolute nonsense to me. Saudi Arabia has shifted completely its position on the Houthis in the past 2 years, partly prodded by Iran and what's been going on with that, with the normalization. But the bigger question is, for Saudi Arabia, I see a country that's increasingly inward-looking. MBS has one vision, Vision 2030, at any cost. Anything that will achieve that, he will do, including peace with the Houthis. We saw recently there was a massive crisis within Yemen with reference to banking. Members of the PLC, the Presidential Leadership Council, also members of SCC wanted to really do a knockout blow on the Houthis by discoupling them from the international banking system. That would have really been lethal against the Houthis. Last minute, Saudi Arabia steps in. Why? Because the Houthis made clear that if they can target Tel Aviv, they can do that with Riyadh. So now the dynamics between the Houthis and Riyadh are very different than before. And this means that while Houthis are going to get a lot more than they would maybe 2-3 years ago, and day by day, their positioning, their bargaining power is increasing within Yemen. This does not mean that the US or any other actor is going to throw the others in front of us. Having said that, there is still support for these other actors.
Okay, you see.
Right. I mean, the trends you mentioned, that I was mentioning, have been building up for a long time. And clearly, the last year has seen an intensification of Islamophobia, of anti-Semitism, and that's sort of hardly surprising. But not only have things like racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and so on been on the rise for a while, but also what governments have been doing, and that is to try and tighten up limitations on protest. And that preceded 7 October, but it's intensified since. So now we have much more draconian laws, let's say in the United States, not laws maybe, but university guidelines and regulations, but they're happening here too, of course, under different guises, to silence political debate, let alone protest. Now, that's, I think, a very important example of a trend that was already building up for quite a while, under governments of both centre-right and centre-left, as far as I can make that. And I don't see this government, Labour government here, reversing any of this. It's not its inclination. So, yeah, I mean, it has been building up for a long while. We are at one of those moments again where things start to accelerate, and that's what I was trying to get across: is that we've had a long build-up, and we're now at a moment when things that are falling apart really fast. That the world we know won't be there. I mean, you can easily imagine it. I think for a Palestinian in West Bank or Gaza, or even a Palestinian citizen of Israel today, living in an environment that is extraordinarily hostile in every location, at school, in the housing apartment building, or at work. And of course, you can imagine what it's like for the Lebanese right now, where their entire worlds have been shattered, right? And there's no prospect of whatever comes next. But what I'm sort of suggesting, I'm not simply scaremongering, is that I think more and more of the rest of us are going to start to find our worlds overturned. In ways that might be peaceful at first and so on, but we are moving in that direction. And a word on the UK and the Starmer and so on, just that from the moment, even before the election, but certainly after the election, my big fear is that this government has no actual policies on pretty much anything, as far as I can think of. I mean, there's, let's say, none of the boldness that's needed to fix what's gone wrong for the last 20 years. And therefore, my big fear is the next election. Is there going to be a massive, backlash of people who are disappointed with Labour and are going to vote for something on the right, whether that's Nigel Farage or who, I don't know, a revived Conservative Party, but it'll be nastier than the last vote. It's that scares me. This complete vacuum, as far as I can see. I mean, what does this government actually do? I don't know. Sort of pointless.
On that happy note, let's take some questions to save our legs of our mic carrier. So yes, you sir, with the glasses first.
Mike Cushman, formerly of this parish, now Jewish Voice for Labour, among other things. Very struck by Yazid's conclusions, which talk to me about the collapse of the post-45, not just legal order, but moral order. And the conditions for the creation of that order was the damage done to the metropolitan countries of its own people. What we're seeing now is the murder of brown people and not people of the metropolis. And how do we turn moral horror, what I've been calling Gaza side, into actions that constrain governments in the north? Because that's what's required. And you talk about the need to inhibit what might happen in a war between the West and Putin. But history tells us that these changes happen after these wars and not before them.
Thank you. If you take that microphone and hand it to the young man in front of you, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Omar Shahab. I'm a hospital doctor, originally Lebanese, and just here out of interest. Looking forward, Netanyahu made a fairly disingenuous appeal to the Lebanese people within the last 24 hours, asking, to suggest to sort of take their country back. as somebody who's sort of also seen the negative side of Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon, as per my opinion, and potentially half the country, their influence in the country hasn't always been to the betterment of Lebanon as a country. And there is a deep consensus within the country that the Iranian foreign policy is the one that prevails. They didn't go and ask the Lebanese parliament for it to fire on Israel, to start the 2006 war, and the rule of law in terms of trying to indict people for the explosion, for example. All of these things have been stifled. The collapse of the banking sector, their rise has coincided with Lebanon's failure. Does this represent, and is there anywhere, the most optimistic side of you, see in any way an opportunity for Lebanon to rebalance forces of power within it and reclaim, for the central government to reclaim its influence?
We got the question. Could you hand it to the woman behind you with the glasses? Thanks. We'll say something.
Thank you very much for a very informative discussion. I've just got to ask for a clarification from Mohammed. When you mentioned Hamas and doing the 7th of October, did you mention that it was perceived as a way of slowing or against the prospect of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel? Is this the view of Iran, or is this the view of Hamas? So I'm not sure. I think I missed, the argument there. And my question to you is, you talk about the recent development of the Bahraini example, and whether you could see that spreading across the Gulf. And the question for Yazid, thank you for bringing this region into a global perspective. But I would like to hear your views on how does Egypt and also the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, feature in all this recently. We see the closeness of Saudi Arabia not only to the Houthis, but to Iran. They called Iran Shaqiqa, the sister, recently, and the Iranian foreign minister is in Riyadh a day ago. So how do you see the conflict regrowing these relationships that had been hostile for decades?
Okay, thank you. And then, yes, you say you caught my eye. If you hand the microphone back to him, this will be the last question, partly because one of our questions asked so many questions. But you, sir. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Mustafa. I'm Northern Irish Lebanese conflict researcher. I'd like to get back a wee bit more to the title of the topic here a little bit if I can. I think, Mohammed, we've talked a little bit about the restraining factors on Iran quite well, I think, and the larger axis of resistance. What restraining factors do you see there being on the other actor, the major actor in this regional war, the IDF? What are the restraining factors they have? And given those two restraining factors in mind on both sides, what really are the chances of an escalation of this war into a wider regional conflict? Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So that's, on my count, 6 questions. I've made a note of them so you don't have to remember them. Right. So, that's good. I think the first question from Mike is a fascinating one, and let's start with that. And it's a question from an activist, I think, but it's also a question that I think a lot of us struggle with. There is a moral horror, but that moral horror doesn't seem to be translating into popular mobilization and then constraints on government. Or it doesn't seem to be in this country. So how is that translation made? I'll start with Nicola and then go to you. We might keep you out of this because you've got about 6 questions to come. Nicola.
I do think that there has been huge popular mobilisation in the UK against what's happening in Gaza. We've seen over 20, I think it is, national marches in London, and each one of them have had no less than 100,000, and some of them, much greater. So there is a trans, and you know, like most people, I think I speak to are morally horrified by what's happening in Gaza. The problem is, yes, why is that not constraining government? And that is such a crucial question, right? It's as though governments no longer care what people think. And it's not just on this question of Gaza. We can see, you know, more recently on ending the winter fuel allowance for old age pensioners. Hugely unpopular policy. Why is the government pursuing it? It could pursue other policies. So I guess I don't have a clear question, because again we're getting into the field of British politics. But it has struck me how popular protest on its own does not create an immediate shift in government policy. However, I do still think that popular protest is important because it keeps issues on the agenda. It shows people in Gaza that people still care. I mean, they know that these demonstrations are happening. But I also think that those popular mobilisations are leading to other types of actions, or they are helping to draw people into other types of more direct action that are perhaps more directly effective in, for example, stopping arms going to Israel, thinking of like Palestine action. And I think that so as long as there's the space for civil society to mobilise, to express itself, there is still the potential to change things. But what this, as Yazid said, what this government and the previous government was trying to do was actually to narrow the space in which civil society and protest movements and dissent could happen. And that's really dangerous, because definitely if we're silenced, nothing will change. So we can be frustrated that things aren't changing fast enough. Why isn't the government listening to us? Why isn't the government doing more? But if we don't say anything, if we don't go and protest, if we stay silent, then that's definitely not going to change anything. So
thanks. So you see, I have a feeling that you'll be able to fit Mike's question into your kind of the larger hypothesis that you were developing in your first intervention. But just to you, why doesn't moral horror, and I completely agree with you, mass protest, why doesn't that then transform as government constraint?
I agree very much with what Nicola said. I'd add that in this country, I remember the huge protests against the coal tax, as we mentioned, Thatcher, or the immense ones against the Iraq War, which again was totally disregarded by the Blair government. Which isn't to say that these things aren't important and don't have an impact. But I guess, I struggle with this question of what does one do? I'm someone who's done a fair amount during my life, and I think I came to a moment, I was there in West Bank at the start of the Second Intifada, and I immediately concluded, from my understanding of the dynamics of what was driving this in Israel and Palestine and so on, that the window for a two-state solution, never mind whether it's two-state or one-state, I will get into that, that window had closed then. So from then on, as it were, we'd gone down the wrong fork of the road. And then to sort of come back 14 or 20 or 24 years later and say, sort of, what can we do? Well, there are a lot of things that could have been done that have been way more effective if they were done then. And trying to do them now just can't be as effective. So that may sound very pessimistic, but what I'm trying to get at is that there are no quick solutions, easy ones. We're in this for the long, long haul. And that's sort of what I meant by the broad perspective. We're all in this together, whatever our race, creed, nationality, etc. We need to be organizing, mobilizing, developing ideas, developing leadership for a very long time to come. Let me give you a very horrible example, if you like, but a useful one. The people in America who, over the past decades, emerged behind Donald Trump and got votes and pushed on things like abortion rights and education, those sort of two big things in America. They first got together in the mid-1970s. They organized in the mid-1970s and worked out what are the things we should really focus on over the very long term. Reagan came to power, that gave them some breather, more oxygen. But they've been around for a very long time planning things that only really came to fruition. Of course, they couldn't have brought them things like the repeal of Roe Wade on abortion in America just through their own activism. But they had the organization, they had the focus, they reached out to the Catholic right, to the born again, etc. They'd lined it all up so that as and when political opportunities arose, they were ready to seize them and then to push them and radicalize them, which is what people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have done in Israel. They work on a permissive environment, but they have radicalized it in particular directions. And it's partly the complete collapse of the so-called secular liberal elite of Israel. Basically, it's gone. I mean, it might be there, not everyone has emigrated, but as an organized force, as political parties, as leaders, as an alternative policy, they don't exist anymore. So the far right in Israel doesn't have to be the majority in a voting sense, but they're the only people with a dynamic agenda. So I'm just suggesting that anyone else here who has other values, we really have to be working for the long term, because we're not going to get quick results. We're going to face a lot of disappointment, lots of defeats. One thing we can offer each other, I think, is solidarity and coalition building, which are more or less the same thing. In other words, Palestinians, pro-Palestinians have to build alliances with people fighting anti-Semitism, with people fighting, for brown and black people in this country, or in the United States, or in Italy, or in France. We have to be fighting on all these things, and to be aware that bread and butter issues are hugely important, that people, need to see futures. As I gave the example earlier of African Americans, I'm citing a conversation with someone who said, you're a bit self-involved. Do you realize what it took for me, a black person, to get to where I am, where I've got a political career ahead? And you have to be able to discuss that. And that's also about class and about all these things. So I'm, again, very broad terminology, because I think many of the little sort of more tactical suggestions I might have had, they're all necessary, but they're not going to change things. And we have to be thinking long term. And that really means building alliances. And one thing I think the pro-Palestine movement has lacked, broadly speaking, in Palestine and beyond, is there isn't recognized ethical and political leadership. Palestinians, youth, people like my kids, students, they've done amazing things over the past year. It's astonishing. But they have lacked the kind of leadership that could tell them where to focus, what's right and what's wrong, what fights not to get into, and all sorts of things of that kind. I could get into more of that. Do you want me to touch on the regional?
Not yet, no, because we're now going to go, I think, to Lebanon, and the question that I think we could bring people back in on. Broadly, let me try and not do damage to your question. With the defeats that Hezbollah has suffered, does this create a window of opportunity for the reform of Lebanese politics, or a new politics in Lebanon? Who wants to tackle that?
I guess this ties into what I said earlier about the collapse of political settlements, i.e., the post-43, post-92, post-whatever in Lebanon. It's a sort of wonderful example of failed state in a sense. I've often said, I've thought. But I think October 2019 is so huge, the moment when the financial system collapsed entirely, basically, right? And people were left to fend for themselves. And that's where I think the resemblance is with Syria and elsewhere. You want bread? You need electricity, they'll find it. I mean, this is what the government does in Syria. It's what it does in Lebanon. And it's us. Why are you looking at us? What do we have to do with this? They fundamentally transformed the nation. Our idea, our notion of what the state is for. Right? It doesn't even, they don't regulate markets. I'm not talking about privatizing or nationalizing. They don't even provide a basic level of regulation. So if it's medication, fuel supply, pollution, education, anything, they just sort of say, well, it's just not our business. When it comes to manipulating money markets, they do that, and of course cream a lot. But they've shifted the entire burden of all that's happened in Lebanon onto the middle classes. Anyone with a dollar account, such as you, I'm sure know very well, and you too. So say, Hezbollah magically disappears entirely with or without a fight. What about the rest of that? I mean, Hezbollah helped protect the people who created that situation. That was a horrendous mistake. And their mistakes go earlier, to their role in Syria, their role in the port explosion in 2020, their role in 2008. I mean, the list is long. But even if you take all of that out of the picture, you're going to persuade me that Gibran Basir and Libya and all these and Samir Jaja and all the rest of them suddenly are going to turn into people who actually provide services. Any Greeks in the audience? I love Greece. I spend a lot of my time there. Greece is what Lebanon should try and aspire to be. Every geek tells me about how much corruption there is. Massive corruption, right? But it's clean, and there's services. So this corrupt, kleptocratic elite of Greece gives something in return. I keep wishing Lebanese elites would do at least that.
After a massive financial crisis. Now we get to Manawi's questions. Firstly, to Mohammed on a point of qualification, which is the normalization issue and Iran on 7th of October. But then the Bahraini use of drones spreading. Then I think to Yazid, the role of Egypt and Saudi in the crisis. And I know that Nicola is in fact an expert on Egypt, so he could answer that as well. So I suppose the big question is, this crisis is unfolding and spreading from Gaza through the unreported horrors that are unfolding on the West Bank, now into Lebanon. But the regions there, with all the problems well documented in this room in a series of Middle East Centre lectures for years in the past, what does that mean for Egypt? What does that mean? I think you've already touched on MBS, but it struck me as quite amazing that MBS seemed to be moving towards normalization when clearly he has a population much larger than his neighbours who were vehemently and passionate against it. I've just got back from the Gulf, traveled through Kuwait, moved it. You can feel the popular anger about what's happening, and yet still, Bahrain, the normalization and the relationship with the ruling elites of the Gulf has clearly marginalized the population's pro-Palestinian solidarity, and I suspect what's happened after the 7th of October has caught them out on open territory with no excuse. But so, firstly, Mohammed, the point of clarification, but then I think the region, certainly Nicola on Egypt, and Mohammed on Saudi Arabia, and then
yes, a lot to take in, but MBS, you guys know about Bob Woodward? The guy became very famous writing about Watergate, and then he's been writing a bunch of scoops. It's always difficult to discern what's true or not, but he does have a lot of juicy quotes. And there's one quote about MBS that circulated on Twitter last time. I'm going to read it out loud. It's about a conversation that Lincoln had with MBS around the time of October 2023. And it was about his demand for a path to Palestinian state before Saudi Arabia would normalize relations with Israel. Do I want it? MBS said and tapped his heart. Woodward wrote. It doesn't matter that much. Do I need it? Absolutely. So I think that really says it all. He doesn't need to care about the Palestinian cause, but he has grasped that he needs something in exchange for agreeing to it. And initially, after October 7, my sense was that, is this going to stop normalization? No, but it's going to allow MBS to exact a higher price for it. And the higher price is in the form of an enrichment program and security guarantees that he could never achieve in the United States otherwise. And he has not yet gone to that extent of normalizing, but will he do so under the next president? Possibly. That's where I would put my money. About the question to do with, I believe, Bahrainis and other possible groups. So the axis of resistance tries to be cross-sectarian. Reality is that it's mostly Shia actors. And if you look in the Gulf, there are two countries which stand out in terms of having a Shia opposition. One is Bahrain, which I spoke about, and the members of the group that launched the cruise missile at Israel, they left Bahrain in the aftermath of 2011, the Arab Spring protests. So they've been in Iraq and Syria for about a decade now. The only other country in the GCC which has a sizable Shia minority, Saudi Arabia, of course, and the dynamics there are a bit different. Number one is that MBS, in connection with the outbreak of unrest, and which you know better than I, he demolished the Shia majority cities in the name of urban revitalization, which makes urban warfare actually a lot more difficult. He changed the architecture of warfare physically. He went into the alleys of Awami and demolished them, razed them to the ground. And he said, well, this is Vision 2030, right? Another thing to do with Saudi Arabia is that the dynamic with Iran is added. And then we have normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia, right? Which some view as a prerequisite for normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So if, let's say, Bahrainis have an easier time firing missiles at Bahrain from Iran, a place like Iran, that would possibly be connected to the fact that the only GCC countries that has not yet normalized relations with Iran is Bahrain. And part of the reason why Bahrain has not normalized is because Iran has a set of demands, part of which includes the release of many of the Shia opposition leaders, including people like Ali Salman. And the king recently announced amnesty, but we didn't see any of the major leaders there, right? So if you look over the past 18 months or so, where you've seen the UAE, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, all of them normalized with Iran, the only holdout is Bahrain. So do I see a possibility for escalation of Bahraini militants? Absolutely. But even now, when we've seen the Iran-Israel escalation, we've seen some Iraqi actors like Qatar Hezbollah issuing a statement saying that, very uncryptically, if there is an attack on Iranian energy facilities, 12 million barrels of oil is going to be taken off the market, meaning that an attack on Saudi Arabia is on the table. And the GCC foreign ministers and the Iranian foreign ministers had a meeting in Doha 3 days ago. The Iranian foreign minister was in Saudi Arabia today. Having Doha 3 days ago was, I'm going to report this, not reported yet, they managed to get a pledge from the GCC foreign ministers of neutrality. That if the Israel attacks, we will not be part of it, and we will not allow the United States to use our airspace. So I hope that makes sense, the dynamics that in Saudi Arabia you have Iran as a restraining factor, Bahrain less so, because they still want to use them as a chip.
New Zealand, I'll leave Nicola to last.
Oh, I thought Nicola was going to do Egypt.
Well, no, you can go because we had you last, so there's kind of equal opportunities in order, so you can go now, and then Nicola can have the last word. And then.
Well, why don't we pick up on one thing that hasn't been mentioned at all on regional conflict, which is Bibi promising a new regional order. Benjamin Netanyahu's favorite minister, right? And he's sort of dusting off an old playbook, going back as far as Ariel Sharon in 1982, justifying the invasion of Lebanon, and then using exactly the same terms of redrawing the regional order of the Middle East, but also to 1996, when a bunch of American neocons like Richard Pearl and others developed this whole notion of radically transforming the Middle East. And I forget if Netanyahu was in the meeting or not, but he's very closely associated with those people. So he's in a way just pulled out the old playbook, and it may be sort of a lot of bombast and rhetoric because he's scaring people and threatening. And a lot of this, I think, is leverage always over Western governments, and especially the United States administration. There's always the threat of an even bigger war in order to keep them as quiet as possible, should they think of putting any pressure or setting any limits. Now, that's A. B, what would such a regional order look like? I mean, who's he thinking of, really? And in my view, given that there's at least half a dozen Arab countries that are, in civil conflict or whatever and are collapsed, several more that are, either two of which have treaties with Israel, so Egypt and Jordan already have peace and are in deep financial difficulty and very reliant on US and European and British support of all kinds, and therefore unlikely to make trouble. And therefore Netanyahu doesn't even need to worry about them or think about them. They don't, I think, occupy anything important in the pecking order of this new regional order in his view, to the extent that he has an idea of it. Morocco is a bit too far, etc. We end up basically with, I think, two countries. United Arab Emirates, which he might perceive as a genuine partner, which, because itself it has its own strategic ambition in the Red Sea, Horn of Africa, in other parts of Africa, etc. And this is a country that clearly, in the reshaping, the reimagining of Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, sees itself as that kind of Spartan power. And Saudi Arabia. I mean, these are the only two, I think, that really matter from an Israeli perspective or from Netanyahu's perspective. Saudi Arabia, for all sorts of reasons, is not as gung-ho, it's not outward going. I think Hans gave us very interesting insight there. But should the Emirates think that they're going to be part of this, buddy-buddy relationship, should they think that? I suspect it'll be more like the UK-US special relationship, where it's mostly British people who talk about it. The Americans sort of, think, who's that yapping at our ankles? And I think that Israel and Netanyahu, people like Netanyahu, will always regard their partners in the region, such as they are, as basically someone who has to follow along, or at best as a junior partner. I don't think they'll regard the Emirates as a genuine equal partner in this endeavor, even if they try to play that game. I'll stop there.
That's great. Nicola, we've now run out of time, so you've got the last word. You can do, I think, I would like you to do two things. Firstly, say whatever you want about Egypt and its role in the crisis, but I think more widely than that, we leave it to you to sum up what you think that the main points this audience should take away from that. Two small things.
The pressure. So, just briefly on Egypt, I think what this time, the war in Gaza has been, a godsend for the Egyptian regime. Before October last year, looking back to the summer of 2023, Egypt was in the midst of an ever-growing financial crisis. It appeared that Saudi Arabia was no longer willing to give further money to prop up the regime. They were unhappy with the regime and its general direction. And so when the war broke out in October, that gave Egypt the ability to get funding from the IMF. That's what opened up that possibility, and that's also has enabled Egypt to also attract further funding from the Gulf. So without that money, the Egyptian economy was really about to tank by all the estimations of the experts. So really, that's worked out really well for Egypt, and we can see how Egypt's dependence on Western donors on the Gulf is also shaping its policy towards Israel's actions in the Gaza Strip. There's a lot of rhetoric about condemning what Israel's doing or opposing it, or expressing strong concerns, whatever diplomats do. It was really interesting that when it came down to it, apparently the Egyptian government was really unhappy about Israel occupying the Philadelphia corridor, and that was supposed to be a red line for the Egyptian regime. because that that goes outside of that's a violation of the Camp David Accords. But in practice, Israel has occupied the Philadelphia corridor and doesn't look like it's going to leave anytime soon. So, and there's nothing really that Egypt will do. Egypt's not. There's no way that Egypt is going to get into any sort of military confrontation with Israel. So yes, so that's also really bad for Egyptians, right? This regime has been given a shot in the arm, which has kept it going for another year or so, whilst meanwhile, this is the most repressive regime that Egyptians have ever experienced. The general economic situation for most Egyptians is deteriorating. So yeah, it's bad news for Egypt. And this is what I mean about, the longer this war goes on, the impacts of it will continue to consolidate and get worse. And it's not just about what's happening to the people of Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon, but it's also the political leaders that benefit from either Western support or, in the case of Iran and the axis of evil, the political capital that they get from opposing Western imperialism in the region. So, all of this is just creating further instability down the line. I think I would like to end on a note of what the question that I posed at the beginning is: what can we do to prevent this war? And maybe in the short term, I'm not so optimistic, but I think it's really important that there is a concerted effort now to isolate Israel on the international stage, to keep up the pressure on governments to stop arming Israel, to boycott Israel in any fora, sport, culture, academia, because I think it's only going to be that sort of longer term isolation of Israel that is what will pressure Israel to change, because it's obvious that Western governments have been, until now, unwilling to put any pressure on Israel. I imagine that perhaps at the General Assembly we might see more movement, given that the majority of the world is opposing what Israel is doing in Gaza. So, but these things are not going to happen overnight. So we can't expect anything to get better in the short term, but we can act to try and change or make possible that things will change in the future, and hopefully we can learn from the experience of anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, which that took several decades, but in the end apartheid fell. And maybe it's not all hunky-dory in South Africa, but at least people are not living under a racist segregation regime anymore. So.
Right, thank you, Nicola. We've now run out of time. I need to thank our incredibly eloquent and knowledgeable panelists, Yazid, Nicola, Mohammed, and to thank you and apologise for keeping you 7 minutes over time, but I'm sure you'll forgive me that, given the quality of discussion coming in from the platform. I thank you very much, and I'm sure we will meet again at another Middle East event.